In the heart of St. Mary's Parish, nestled within the rolling hills of a small, deeply religious Catholic town, life seemed to move at its own slow, deliberate pace. The church, an imposing stone building with towering stained-glass windows and a bell that chimed every hour, stood at the town's center. Its spire stretched toward the heavens, a constant reminder of the town's devotion. Surrounding it, narrow streets curved through rows of modest houses, the air always thick with the scent of burning candles and incense drifting from the church. To the side of the church was the rectory, where Father Michael lived with his wife Claire. Their home was simple but stately, its heavy oak door adorned with a brass crucifix. Father Michael was a figurehead in the community, his sermons powerful, his advice sought after by everyone. Tall, with piercing eyes that seemed to look through a person rather than at them, he commanded respect wherever he went. But for all his charm and wisdom, Father Michael was a distant man. Even at home, his mind was often elsewhere, on his duties, his faith, and the many confessions he heard. Claire, meanwhile, grew accustomed to his absence. His love for her, if it had ever been there, had long been buried beneath the weight of his priestly responsibilities. Across the garden and down a short cobbled path sat the convent, a quiet and serene building where the Sisters of St. Mary's lived. Among them was Sister Agnes. To the community she was known for her unwavering devotion and selflessness. But inside, Sister Agnes battled feelings she could neither confess nor control. Her vows weighed heavy, not only in the promises they kept her from breaking, but in the desires they forced her to hide. Claire had always been drawn to the convent, initially finding comfort in the calm presence of the nuns during her husband's long hours away. Over the past months, her visits had become more frequent, though it was Sister Agnes she sought out most. The two women spent afternoons together, walking through the convent gardens or talking in the chapel's shadowy corners. Their conversations started innocently enough, about faith, loneliness, and the weight of expectation. But lately, something had shifted. There were moments when Claire would catch Sister Agnes staring at her for just a little too long. At first, it felt like nothing more than an unspoken understanding, a shared feeling of being out of place. Claire, often alone in the large rectory, found in Sister Agnes a companionship she'd never had with her husband. The nun, for her part, felt a warmth that terrified her. Their fingers brushed occasionally when handing off a cup of tea, the touches lingering a second longer each time. Neither woman spoke of it, but both knew that something was growing between them. Father Michael, despite his focus on the church, had begun to notice Claire's absences. She no longer waited up for him as she once did, and the rare moments they spent together felt more like ritual than marriage. He could feel her slipping away, though he told himself it was nothing more than a phase. A passing distance that time would heal. Outside, the sun began to set over the church, casting long shadows across the town's narrow streets. It was a Friday evening, late November, and the first bite of winter was creeping into the air. Another week was coming to an end, yet beneath the surface of this quiet town, something far more dangerous was just beginning. Claire's visits to the convent became a regular part of her routine, a quiet escape from the coldness of her home. At first, she told herself it was for the peace, for the calm that the convent offered. But as the weeks passed, it became clear even to her that it was Sister Agnes she sought. Their conversations, once polite and distant, grew more personal with each meeting. They spoke of the weight of expectation, of the isolation they both felt in their respective lives. Claire confessed her loneliness, how Father Michael's devotion to the church left little room for her. Sister Agnes listened quietly, her eyes soft with understanding. Late one evening, after a long walk through the convent gardens, their conversation took an unexpected turn. The sky had darkened, and the faint smell of earth filled the air as a cool breeze stirred the leaves. They sat together on a bench, closer than usual, the silence between them charged with something unspoken. Claire, feeling vulnerable, admitted what she hadn't dared to before. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. "Not as his wife, at least. It's like I've disappeared." Sister Agnes turned to her, something shifting in her eyes. "I feel it too," she said, her voice low. "I question everything sometimes. My vows, my faith. It's so much harder than I ever imagined." Their hands touched, just for a moment, but long enough to send a spark through both of them. They both pulled away slightly, unsure, but the air between them had changed. It was as though the walls they had carefully built around themselves had cracked, and neither could pretend it hadn't happened. That night, after their usual conversation, neither of them moved to leave. Claire's heart raced as she turned toward Sister Agnes. The moonlight cut through the trees, casting shadows over the garden. In that quiet, secluded space, Claire reached out first. Their eyes met, hesitation, fear, and something else in both of them. When their lips finally touched, it was soft, tentative, as though neither fully believed it was happening. For a long moment, they stayed like that, frozen in the intensity of it. When they finally pulled away, breathless, neither spoke. The guilt hit almost immediately, but there was something else too, a relief, a release of something they had been holding back for too long. From that night on, everything changed. They continued to meet in secret, always under the cover of darkness, always when they were sure no one would see. Claire found excuses to leave the rectory late at night, slipping out while Father Michael slept. Sister Agnes would wait for her in the quiet corners of the convent garden, or in the darkened hallways where no one dared to go after hours. Their relationship grew more intense with each meeting, a mix of passion and fear. Every kiss, every touch came with the heavy weight of their guilt. Claire was tormented by thoughts of her marriage, though she couldn't deny the connection she felt with Sister Agnes. It was something she hadn't experienced in years, if ever. And for Sister Agnes, the struggle was even greater. Her religious vows, her commitment to the church, felt like shackles now, confining her in ways she could barely stand. Yet, no matter how hard they tried to fight it, they couldn't stay away from each other. They both knew what they were doing was dangerous, that it couldn't last. But with each secret meeting, they pushed that thought aside, allowing themselves to be consumed by what had begun that night in the garden. Sister Agnes sat in the dim light of the chapel, hands clasped tightly together, eyes squeezed shut. The air was heavy with the scent of burning candles, and the silence felt oppressive, weighing down on her. She tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Every time she opened her mouth to ask for forgiveness, the memory of Claire's touch flooded her mind, making her heart race in a way that terrified her. It had been weeks since that night in the garden, and they hadn't stopped meeting. Each encounter left Agnes more conflicted than the last. She knew she was breaking her vows, betraying everything she had promised to God, and the fear of divine punishment loomed over her like a dark cloud. Every mass, every confession she heard from the town's faithful only deepened her guilt. What right did she have to counsel others, to stand before the altar, when she herself was drowning in sin? But no matter how much she prayed for strength, no matter how often she swore to end it, she couldn't stay away from Claire. Every night they spent together felt like a stolen moment of peace, something so desperately needed that it eclipsed the shame that followed. She was torn between the life she had chosen and the passion she couldn't control. And now, more than ever, the walls felt like they were closing in. On a Tuesday night in early December, just as the town was beginning to prepare for Christmas, Claire sneaked out of the rectory once again. The cold wind bit at her cheeks as she hurried across the courtyard toward the convent. Inside, Sister Agnes was waiting, pacing nervously by the window. When Claire stepped through the door, they embraced quickly, their desperation palpable. "I'm losing my mind," Agnes whispered, her voice trembling. "Every day, it feels like he's watching me, like God is going to strike me down. I can't—" She paused, her breath shallow. "I can't do this much longer." Claire stroked her arm, her own guilt gnawing at her insides, but she couldn't let go either. "We'll be careful," she said softly. "No one knows, it's just us." But Sister Agnes wasn't so sure anymore. Lately, she had the feeling they weren't alone. She'd caught the eyes of some of the other nuns on her more than once, lingering too long, as if they knew something. And then there was Father Michael. He had seemed more attentive lately, watching Claire with a sharpness he hadn't shown in months. The thought of him finding out made Agnes's stomach churn. She pulled back from Claire, shaking her head. "We have to stop," she said. "This is wrong. We'll both be ruined if anyone finds out." Claire didn't answer, but the look in her eyes showed that she understood all too well. Yet the thought of returning to the empty life she had with Father Michael, the coldness of their home, was unbearable. She needed Agnes, needed the warmth and the connection that had been missing for so long. What neither of them knew was that Father Michael had already begun to suspect something. It had started a few weeks back, when he woke up late one night and found Claire's side of the bed empty. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming she'd gone downstairs for a glass of water or couldn't sleep. But the next night, she was gone again, and the night after that. Each time she returned quietly, slipping back into bed as though nothing was wrong. But something was wrong. He could feel it. One Sunday morning after Mass, Father Michael had been putting away his vestments when he found it, tucked into Claire's coat pocket, carelessly folded, as though it had been forgotten. It was a note, a simple one written in a hurried hand. "Meet me in the garden tonight. I need to see you. A." Father Michael's blood ran cold as he stared at the note. It wasn't long, but it was enough. His mind raced, piecing together the late-night absences, the sudden distance between them, the strange connection between Claire and Sister Agnes. He knew the handwriting well. He had seen Sister Agnes write countless times during church meetings. The truth hit him with a force that made his chest tighten. He didn't confront Claire right away. Instead, he began to watch her more closely. Each evening he observed her movements, subtly questioning her about where she had been, who she had seen. She brushed him off casually, her smile forced, but he could see the unease in her eyes. She was hiding something, and he was determined to find out what. As his suspicions deepened, so did his paranoia. On a bitterly cold Friday night, he followed Claire when she slipped out of the house again. Staying far enough behind to avoid detection, he watched as she hurried toward the convent. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw her disappear through the garden gate, where he knew Sister Agnes would be waiting. The sight of his wife and the nun together sent a wave of rage through him, but he forced himself to retreat, his mind churning with a dark, festering anger. Back at the convent, Sister Agnes's anxiety only grew. One evening, after another hurried meeting with Claire, she turned to her lover, her face pale. "I don't think we're alone," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone in the shadows. "I've felt it for days now, like we're being watched." Claire stiffened, her heart pounding at the words. "By who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sister Agnes shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know, but I can feel it." Neither of them said it, but both knew who they feared. Father Michael. The tension between the three of them, silent, unspoken, but palpable, was tightening like a noose. Every day it became harder to pretend that things were as they had been, harder to act as though nothing was happening. And yet, neither Claire nor Sister Agnes could stop what had already been set into motion. Late one evening in mid-December, the coldest night of the year, Father Michael sat in his study, watching the clock. The house was silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. It was almost midnight, and once again, Claire's side of the bed was empty. His suspicion had festered for weeks, but tonight something inside him snapped. He could no longer sit idly by and wonder. He had to know. Moving silently, he slipped on his coat and followed her out into the night. The frost on the ground crunched beneath his boots as he stayed far enough behind to avoid being seen, his heart pounding in his chest. Claire moved quickly through the empty streets, the pale moonlight casting long shadows across the cobblestones. She didn't hesitate as she reached the convent gate, slipping inside like she had done countless nights before. Father Michael paused just outside the gate, his breath visible in the frigid air. He could hear voices, hushed, barely audible but unmistakable. Peering around the edge of the stone wall, he saw them. Claire and Sister Agnes stood together in the garden, close, too close. The soft glow of a lantern illuminated their faces, both pale and full of emotion. They were speaking in whispers, but Father Michael couldn't make out the words. His fists clenched involuntarily, but he forced himself to stay hidden, his heart hammering as he watched what came next. Claire reached out and touched Sister Agnes's arm, a gesture so intimate, so familiar, it made his stomach turn. Then, before his eyes, Claire leaned in and kissed her. It was brief, gentle, but the truth of it hit him like a hammer. His wife, and the nun. The shock coursed through his veins, paralyzing him in place as he watched them embrace, unaware of his presence. Rage boiled beneath the surface, but he did nothing. He couldn't. He stood frozen in disbelief, unable to process the sight in front of him. After a few moments he turned and walked away, his body rigid with fury. Each step he took back toward the rectory felt heavier, as though the weight of what he had just seen was pulling him down into the earth. When he reached the house, Father Michael shut the door behind him and collapsed into a chair. He pressed his hands to his temples, his mind racing, heart pounding. He replayed the scene over and over in his head, unable to stop. The betrayal stung like a wound, fresh and deep. His pride, his sense of control, had been shattered. How could she, his own wife, humiliate him like this? And with a nun, the thought of the church, his church, sank into his mind like poison. If anyone found out, his reputation would be destroyed. He had spent years building this life, becoming the pillar of the community, a man people respected. All of that could be ruined in an instant. The image of Claire and Sister Agnes together haunted him, an image he couldn't erase no matter how hard he tried. He didn't sleep that night. Rage and humiliation twisted inside him, a storm he couldn't contain. But beyond the anger, another feeling grew, an urgent need for control. He couldn't let this spiral out of control. He had to act, and soon. The following morning, he was waiting in the kitchen when Claire entered, bleary-eyed from another late night. She moved around the room, avoiding his gaze, but he couldn't hold back any longer. "Where were you last night?" His voice was low, tight with restraint. Claire froze, her back to him. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she turned, forcing a smile. "I couldn't sleep," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I went for a walk." "A walk?" Father Michael's eyes burned into her. "Through the convent garden, was it?" The color drained from her face. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, trying to sound casual, but the panic in her voice was undeniable. "I followed you, Claire," he said, standing now, his voice rising. "I saw everything." Her eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief, and she took a step back. "Michael, You and her," he spat, cutting her off. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been sneaking behind my back like this?" His voice shook with rage, his fists clenching at his sides. Claire's mouth opened, but no words came out. She stood there, trembling, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. Slowly, her shoulders slumped, and the tears began to well in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." "How long?" Father Michael demanded again, his voice rising. Claire sobbed, unable to meet his eyes. "I don't know," she said through tears. It happened. You're never here, Michael. You don't see me. You don't care about us. I was alone, and she... You think that excuses this?" His voice was thick with disgust. "With a nun? You've ruined everything, Claire. Everything." She collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she sobbed. "But I couldn't live like that anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I needed something." For a moment, there was silence. Father Michael stared at her, his chest heaving with anger. He couldn't hear her apologies. All he could see was the betrayal, the humiliation she had brought upon him, upon their marriage, upon the church. He turned away, his mind racing. His reputation was at stake. Everything he had worked for could crumble because of Claire's weakness. The shame of it burned inside him. This could never become public. He couldn't allow it. And then, slowly, a dark idea took root in his mind. He knew what had to be done. As Claire continued to cry behind him, Father Michael's face hardened. He would not let this affair destroy him. He would act to protect the sanctity of his position, to save the church from scandal. Claire had made her choice, and so had Sister Agnes. Now, it was time for him to make his. It was a bitterly cold night, just after midnight, when Father Michael slipped out of the rectory, his mind racing with dark thoughts. The town was quiet, the streets empty, but he moved quickly, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from the burning conviction that had taken hold of him. He was no longer just a man. He was an instrument of God's will, chosen to punish the sinners who had defiled everything sacred. The knife felt heavy in his pocket, its cold steel pressing against his leg as he walked toward the convent. He had followed them enough times to know where they would be, hidden away in the garden, thinking they were safe. Tonight, they wouldn't see him coming. As he approached the convent's gate, his pulse quickened. The garden was dark, illuminated only by a faint sliver of moonlight, and there, just beyond the hedges, he saw them. Claire and Sister Agnes stood together, their heads close, whispering. The sight of them, his wife and the nun, together in their sin, made his stomach turn. Without thinking, he stepped into the garden. His footsteps were quiet, deliberate, until he was only a few feet away. They didn't notice him at first, too caught up in each other. But then Claire looked up, her eyes widening in shock when she saw him standing there, his face contorted in rage. "Michael," she whispered, stepping back. "What are you doing here?" Father Michael's eyes burned with fury as he stared at them. "You've defiled everything," he growled, his voice low and trembling with anger. "Both of you. You've destroyed our marriage. You've betrayed your vows. You've betrayed God." "Michael, please," Claire said, holding out a hand as if to calm him. "We can explain." "Explain?" His voice cracked, and he took a step closer, his hand gripping the knife in his pocket. "There's nothing to explain. You've sinned. You've sinned against me, against the church, against God himself." Sister Agnes, trembling beside Claire, tried to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "Father Michael, we didn't mean for this to happen. Please, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he spat, his eyes wild. "You've both destroyed everything I've worked for, everything sacred." Before they could react, Father Michael pulled the knife from his pocket, the blade glinting in the moonlight. He lunged at Claire first, his movements fueled by pure, unrelenting rage. She gasped, her hands flying up in a futile attempt to stop him, but it was too late. The knife plunged into her chest, the sickening sound of steel tearing through flesh echoing in the night. Claire's eyes widened in shock and pain as she stumbled backward, collapsing onto the cold ground, blood spreading across her shirt. Sister Agnes screamed, but before she could run, Father Michael turned on her. His face was twisted with fury, his eyes glassy, almost unrecognizable. He charged at her, and she raised her hands in defense, but it did nothing to stop him. The knife slashed across her arm, then again across her chest. She fell to her knees, sobbing, begging for mercy, but there was none left in him. Each stab was more brutal than the last. blood sprayed across the nearby statues of saints, staining the stone faces of the Virgin Mary and Christ as Father Michael continued his frenzied attack. The garden, once a place of peace and quiet, was now a scene of unimaginable violence, the air thick with the metallic smell of blood. Finally, he stopped, his breath ragged, his chest heaving. He looked down at Sister Agnes's lifeless body, her white habit soaked in crimson, and then at Claire, her eyes wide and empty. The knife slipped from his hand, clattering to the ground with a hollow sound. For a moment, the world was silent. Father Michael stood in the middle of the carnage, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. The moonlight bathed the scene in an eerie glow, casting long shadows over the blood-streaked ground. It was done. The next morning, just before dawn, Father Michael stood in the garden, staring down at the blood-soaked bodies of Claire and Sister Agnes. His hands trembled, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. For a brief moment he considered turning himself in, confessing. But the thought of the shame, the destruction of his reputation, was too much to bear. He couldn't let the world see him as a murderer. He needed a plan, a way to hide the truth. Taking a deep breath, he began to move quickly, carefully. He dragged Claire's body closer to Sister Agnes, positioning them as if they had fought each other. With unsteady hands, he wiped the knife clean and placed it in Claire's hand, curling her fingers around the hilt. It felt wrong, but he forced himself to finish. He arranged Sister Agnes's body to make it look as though she had been the final victim, setting the scene to tell a story of a crime driven by passion and jealousy. As the first light of morning crept over the horizon, Father Michael stepped back, surveying his work. The sight was grotesque, but the narrative was clear. The affair would be the reason, the explanation for the violence. No one would suspect him, not the beloved priest, not the man the town trusted above all others. Hours later, within moments of the discovery, the town was thrown into chaos. Word spread like wildfire. Claire, the priest's wife, and Sister Agnes, a nun, found dead in the convent garden. The rumors were immediate, scandalous. An affair, a forbidden love, had led to a tragedy. Gossip echoed in every corner of the town. The once quiet community, so deeply rooted in faith, was now consumed by whispers of sin and betrayal. Most believed the story. Claire, overcome with guilt or rage, had killed the nun in a jealous fit, then taken her own life. The townspeople were devastated, but also eager to believe it. The affair explained the deaths, as shocking as it was. It gave them a way to make sense of the horror. But not everyone was convinced. A few detectives, called in to investigate, found inconsistencies in the crime scene. Claire's grip on the knife seemed unnatural, too forced. Sister Agnes's injuries didn't line up with a simple struggle, and Father Michael's calm demeanor in the face of such a personal tragedy unsettled them. Some of the older members of the church, too, found his grief strangely hollow, as though he were playing a part. Still, there was no evidence, no proof beyond the staged scene. For now, Father Michael's story held. But doubt lingered in the air, a shadow over the perfect image he had so carefully tried to protect. By mid-January, barely a month after the murders, Father Michael's life had begun to spiral out of control. At first, he had convinced himself that the staged murder-suicide would hold, that the town's whispers would eventually fade. But the weight of what he had done settled heavily in his mind. Each night, as he lay awake in the rectory, the image of Claire's lifeless eyes and Sister Agnes's bloodied body haunted him. Guilt gnawed at him constantly, no matter how hard he tried to suppress it. The once steady routine of his days became unbearable. He found himself muttering prayers under his breath at all hours, begging for forgiveness, though he wasn't sure whose forgiveness he sought, God's or his own. He could no longer look the townspeople in the eye, their trust in him feeling like an unbearable burden. By early February, his behavior had become noticeably erratic. During Mass, he would lose his place mid-sermon, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if someone was watching him. He began locking himself in the church for hours, praying obsessively, whispering to the crucifix at the altar. Parishioners noticed the change. The man who had once been their confident leader now seemed paranoid, shrunken, a shell of himself. He avoided conversations, his hands shaking as he gave blessings. Some whispered that the weight of losing both his wife and a beloved nun had broken him, but the guilt wasn't enough to drown out the fear. Father Michael became convinced that someone would eventually piece it all together. His heart raced every time the detectives visited the convent again, or when he saw a lingering look from an old church member. Paranoia seeped into every corner of his mind. Someone would expose him. It was only a matter of time. On a Sunday morning, just before Lent, it all came to a head. As he stood at the pulpit delivering a sermon on repentance, the weight of his sin crashed over him like a tidal wave. The words caught in his throat. He could feel the congregation's eyes on him, their faith in him, and it became unbearable. He had to tell them. He couldn't hold it in anymore. "It was me!" he suddenly blurted, his voice cracking, hands gripping the sides of the lectern. "I killed them!" The church fell silent. For a moment, no one moved, too stunned to react. "I killed Claire and Sister Agnes," Father Michael continued, his voice growing louder, more desperate. "I did it. I couldn't stop myself." Gasps filled the room, and within minutes, people were rushing to their feet, some in disbelief, others in horror. His confession spilled out uncontrollably, years of repression and guilt unraveling in front of the shocked congregation. Within hours, Father Michael was arrested, the truth of his crime finally laid bare. As he was led away in handcuffs, the church doors closing behind him, the small town was left to reckon with the monstrous truth about the man they had once trusted with their souls. In the months following Father Michael's arrest, the town of St. Mary's Parish struggled to make sense of what had happened. The church, once the heart of the community, was now a place stained with the memory of betrayal and violence. Parishioners who had once looked to Father Michael for guidance now spoke of him in hushed tones, unsure how to reconcile the man they had trusted with the murderer he had become. The affair between Claire and Sister Agnes became infamous in the town's history, a tragic tale whispered about in corners for years to come. People debated what drove them. Was it love, desperation, or simply the isolation they both felt? Regardless, their relationship, condemned by both society and the church, became a symbol of repression, of what happens when desires are forced into the shadows. On the anniversary of the murders, the town held quiet memorials for Claire and Sister Agnes, their names forever linked to the scandal and violence that tore the community apart. The garden at the convent, once a place of peace, was now avoided by many, the bloodshed that had occurred there casting a long shadow over it. Years later, the story remained a dark chapter in the town's history, a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked obsession and religious extremism. The line between devotion and madness had blurred in Father Michael's mind, and the consequences had been devastating. In the end, the story of the priest, his wife, and the nun was not just about forbidden love. It was about the cost of living in denial, of hiding the truth until it could no longer be contained. Even now, the town remembers.